And today I will take our discourse elsewhere, and in particular to Schelling, to the great Schelling. So, and in particular, I want to talk about the late Schelling. And even more specifically, I'll be spending the whole time discussing, or at least for the most part, Schelling's lecture on the grounding of positive philosophy, and the citations I'll be drawing from are translated by Bruce Matthews. This is a SUNY publication from 2007. So I'll be looking at Schelling, as you can see from the title, and the capacity of the concept. For lack of a better title, I'll be thinking about the limitations of conceptual capacities in late Schelling's thought. Okay, so the main question that I want to think about today, and the approach to conceptual capacity that I want to undertake, is motivated by one question. The question is, why is there anything at all? Why is there not nothing? This question was of paramount importance to Schelling. It's not his only question. It's one of many important questions for Schelling, but it's, I would argue, one of the most important questions for Schelling. And this question, why is there anything at all, does not first arise in 1842 in his grounding of the positive philosophy lectures when he's in Berlin, after he's taken up what was Hegel's chair. But this question, why is there anything at all, is a question that bothered Schelling his whole life, from the earliest moments of his career until the very end of his life. And we can see this from an early text, the Philosophical Letters on Dogmatism and Criticism, from the 1790s. And this is the next quote on the handout. The main task of all philosophy consists in solving the problem of the existence of the world. So the problem of the existence of the world. Why does the world exist? This is the problem of all philosophy, says Schelling. So as we can see, whether it's the 1790s or all the way to 1840s, Schelling wants to know, why is there something and not nothing? And his thinking is deeply motivated by this question. Now, is this question special to Schelling, or is it shared more widely? And I think it's shared very widely by Schelling and his contemporaries. It's a concern not just of Schelling, but it's a concern of others as well. So I'll read a couple quotes that Schelling, from this text, where Schelling speaks about how contemporary philosophers are also bothered by this question. So beginning here, the great turnaround of more recent times constituted precisely because of the fact that one no longer aims for the predicates, but that one demands to become certain of the thing itself, or the Gegenstände. So what we want is primarily not to put the right predicates with the right things, but we want to get the things themselves. We want to give an account of the fact of the things themselves. He says again, contemporary philosophy involves the derivation of the things themselves, which in the earlier metaphysics were quite simply assumed from mere experience or the general consciousness. In other words, there's a new demand in philosophy, according to Schelling. The demand is to derive the things themselves. In other words, to say why there is something and not nothing. Now, is this really true? If we look at, say, Schelling's contemporary Hegel, or even Fichte, or early romantics like Schlegel, do we find this question? And I think we find the question. We find the question in all of them. I won't go through and cite them all now, but if we want to talk about it in the question and answer, I'd be happy to do that. But I will just note that Hegel, just to take an example, asks this question, although he puts it in a different way, in both the Phenomenology of Spirit and the Science of Logic. And in the Science of Logic, Hegel goes so far as to say that he answers the question, and that philosophy becomes a science ultimately for him only if we can answer, and only if we do answer this question. And that it doesn't remain a mere mystery, a mere paradox, a mere question, but rather philosophy becomes a science by answering this question. So I think this question is of paramount importance. Why is there anything at all and not nothing? To Schelling, it's there his whole career. It's shared by his contemporaries. So if we're going to distinguish Schelling's thought from others, this question itself won't do the trick. But we have to think about how he himself understood the question, why it lands us in paradox, according to Schelling. And to really distinguish his own approach, we have to look at the distinct way in which he handles and responds to the question itself. So Schelling is often accused of, often this is put in the form of an accusation, of constantly rethinking the content of his thought. And Hegel, I believe somewhere says, look, Schelling, he performs his education in public, right? So he's always just, whenever he has a new idea, it just comes out. So people like to divide Schelling's thought into various stages. I'm not going to worry about that right now. It's hard enough work simply to figure out what the argument is in the grounding of positive philosophy. Okay, I have a number of views on this topic, but at least one thing we can say is that there is something that stays the same throughout Schelling's philosophy, throughout most elements of his career and periods of his career, and that is his question. Why is there anything at all? Why is there not nothing? And his preoccupation with this question we see as a constancy throughout his career. So without further introductory notes, we're going to be thinking about this question, and we're going to be doing it by thinking through the grounding of positive philosophy. Okay, so on to the negative philosophy. So the title, Grounding of Positive Philosophy, discusses two kinds of philosophy, the negative and the positive. So first, we're going to talk about the negative, and then we're going to talk about the positive. Why are we going to talk about the negative? Well, we have this question, why is there anything? Or to rephrase it, why is there something and not nothing? Okay, so first we have to think the concept of something in order to understand the question. We have to understand what it is we're asking about. But more than that, why should philosophy itself care about the origin of something? Why should philosophy itself care about being something? And why should it care about this question? Why is there something? So I think the negative philosophy can give us some answer as to why we should care about something, why we should care about the concept of something. So that's what I want to begin with. Okay, so in the grounding of positive philosophy, Schelling invokes Aristotle's notion of philosophy as an inquiry into being qua being. And one reason I think that Schelling invokes this understanding of philosophy is that being qua being seems to be the absolute. And why should philosophy be concerned with the absolute, and what is the absolute? Well, if we go back to the Greek sense of philosophy as love of wisdom, which Schelling discusses in quite a few places in this text, we will remember that philosophy is concerned with what is universal, right? So it wants to know what all forms of wisdom have in common that make them examples of wisdom. But it's not just interested in the universal, it's interested in the unconditioned. It wants to know the wisdom upon which all wisdom depends. So philosophy is interested in the universal, and it's interested in the unconditioned universal. That wisdom that isn't conditioned upon anything else, but conditions everything else. The unconditioned condition, you could say. So philosophy is concerned with the unconditioned universal. And that is, I think, to use German idealist language, the absolute. Philosophy is primarily concerned with the absolute. This is the sacred calling of philosophy, right? To think the absolute. And it seems that being, as the Greeks already recognized, seems to really be that which is absolute. First, anything that you can think about, anything you encounter must be. And so it seems as though everything you encounter, that you think about, that you experience, somehow falls within being. On the other hand, if everything falls within being, it's somehow universal. But if everything is there in it, then there's nothing beyond it. And there's nothing, therefore, that could condition it. And so being looks like it's not only the universal, but it's also unconditioned. And so it seems as though philosophy, in its desire to think the absolute, will be concerned with knowing being, as Aristotle puts it in Book Gamma. And so I'll read the first quote here to get a sense of what it is that negative philosophy is concerned about. With this is then also provided the concept of a negative science whose duty is precisely this, to produce in this manner the concept of what being itself is, through the successive elimination of everything that is not being and that lies implicit or potential in the general and indeterminate concept of being. The science can lead not further than to the aforementioned negative concept, thus in general only to the concept of being itself. So, negative philosophy, first it's a philosophy because it's concerned with the unconditioned universal. That is, it's concerned with arriving at the concept of being. Why is it negative though? Why call it negative? So this is what I want to say a word about why it is negative. What does it negate? And he tells us in the next quote, in this science, however, everything that is contingent is removed. So the negative philosophy, it removes or negates everything contingently related to being. So what it wants to know is what being is. When we ask what is being, we're looking for the what it is to be of being. We're looking to find those concepts or predicates that apply to being as it is. So if we ask what is being, the answer must be being is such and such. But what we're looking for in the is such and such is not what is contingently being, but what being is necessarily. So there are a number of things that seem contingent to being. Plants, stones, the variety of differentiations within being itself seem to be contingently related to being. Being qua being is not necessarily a stone, right? You can be and not be a stone. You can be and not be a plant, right? There's a whole host of contingencies that we discover, a whole host of differentiations that are not endemic to the very concept of being as such. And so what negative philosophy does is it negates everything that is contingently related to being so that it can think the essence or the Wesen of being as such, the unconditioned universal. So this is why it's negative. It's approaching the absolute concept, what it is to be, of being, and it does that through negating everything contingently related to being. So far, pretty traditional understanding of what philosophy does. And so we'll go to the next quote here. The infinite capacity to be, das unendliche Sein können, is also the immediate prius, the immediate concept of being itself. So here we have this idea of the infinite aspect of being again. Being is without limit. It seems to be all-encompassing. And here it is a capacity to be. He'll often talk about concepts as potentials, possibilities, and in some passages he'll use these interchangeably. The word potential in Schelling is rife with ambiguity and debate. So I've intentionally am not speaking about Schelling's philosophy in those terms for now. We can talk about it in more detail afterwards if we want to. But for the sake of clarity, I'm trying to use my own words. So I hope that you will appreciate that. Okay, so what is negative philosophy trying to do? It wants to find out what is that being that is the immediate content of reason? What belongs to it such that it is being? So that's the question, what is the being of being, right? Jardy seems to have this self-predicative kind of formulation that seems to be built into it. And so what's the result of negative philosophy? The science that accomplishes this elimination of what is contingent in the first concept of being, and with this frees being itself, is critical, is of the negative type, and possesses in its result what we have called being itself, das Seiende Selbst, yet still only in thought. So I want to talk about this last qualification. Still only in thought. What does he mean here? Well, when I ask what is being, the only way to answer this question is to say being is such and such. And when I say is such and such, I am predicating some universal or concept to being. And by doing that, I'm giving being some determinacy. I'm saying what it is to be. If I never predicated anything of being, I just had being is, then there would be no what it is to be of being. And that would be very paradoxical because being is what it is to be something. So being is the what it is to be. So when we ask what is being, it needs a predicate. being is such and such. But if you predicate anything of being, and you say what it is to be, then you're differentiating or distinguishing being from what being is not, from what is distinct from being. And thereby you're determining being, you're determining it. Being, therefore, if you answer the question, what is being, and you supply a predicate, you're actually not only asserting that being is universal, which we already know, but you're also saying being has its own determinate being. Being itself is determinate being. To be is to be something. And so Schelling seems to think that to be is to be something. And as long as we have a predicate that applies to be will be something. To put it otherwise, there is something. There is some what it is to be of being itself, by which being is distinct from what it's not. Now, I'm going to come back to that. I'm going to put that to the side for now. But the basic idea here is that negative philosophy not only arrives at being, which is the most universal, but it recognizes that being is determinate. Or to use Heidegger's language, being is a being. Being is a being. If you deny that being is a being, being won't have any determinacy. It won't actually be. So with that in hand, I'll put that to the side. Why can't the negative philosophy by itself answer this question? Go back to it. Why is there anything? Why is there something? So now we see why the concept of something matters, because to be is to be something. And so to be something, to be is to be something. Our question was, what is the absolute? The absolute is being. Being is something. The absolute is something. We have this idea that the absolute is the concept of something. But according to Schelling, concepts have a significant limit. Concepts are not sufficient for their own existence. And this is a really important limitation on the capacities of concepts, what we can accomplish with concepts. If we have a concept of something, it doesn't follow that the concept exists. So because I have a concept of a human being, it doesn't follow that there are particulars that instantiate the concept. Because I have a concept of God, it doesn't follow that there is a God that corresponds to the concept. And so Schelling holds this distinction to be universal. Concepts are not sufficient for their own realization. They're not sufficient for their own existence. They're not sufficient for their own particularization. There's many ways of saying this, right? Concepts are empty without some principle of existence in virtue of which they are realized. So I will read this qualification here. Here we should note that in everything that is real, there are two things to be known. It is entirely two entirely different things. It is two entirely different things to know what a being is, and that it is. The former, the answer to the question what it is, accords me insight into the essence of the thing. Or it provides that I understand the thing, that I have an understanding or a concept of it, or have it itself within the concept. The other insight, however, that it is, does not accord me just the concept, but rather something that goes beyond just the concept, which is existence. So concepts do not exist in virtue of being conceptual. The principle of existence for any concept must come from outside of the concept itself. And this means that the concept is contingently related to existence. That a concept exists is a contingent fact, not a necessary one. Existence is only contingently related to concepts. Okay, so this means that the negative philosophy, when it arrives at the concept of being, it thinks what it is to be, and it says what it is to be is something. Being is to be something. It doesn't know, simply through this elucidation of the concept of determinate being or of being, that this concept exists. But rather, what it has to recognize because of this difference between concept and existence, what it has to recognize is that the principle in virtue of which the concept exists must come from outside the concept itself. So that's what negative philosophy comes to realize. It comes to see that the principle in virtue of which the concept of being, the concept of being something, must come from outside of the concept itself. And this leads actually to a crisis in negative philosophy. Negative philosophy has to come to terms, has to accept that ultimately its concept of being is conditioned. It's not really unconditioned. It thought it had an unconditioned concept, but actually it doesn't have one, because the concept, whatever concept it has, including the most all-encompassing, most universal, most unconditioned concept that it has, will still be conditioned, because the principle of existence of the concept will come from outside of it. The concept cannot supply the sufficient conditions for its own existence. And for that reason, every concept the negative philosophy thinks is conditioned and is not the absolute that it wants. And so negative philosophy isn't complete on its own, but rather the result of the negative philosophy is a demand. It's an Aufgabe. The Aufgabe is ultimately that it wants to know the principle in virtue of which being or determinate being exists, right? And that's our question. Why is there something? What is the principle of existence in virtue of which anything at all is? That's something that positive philosophy will have to take up. So let's look at some quotes here, the transition to the positive. I'll read this quote first. That something exists at all, and particularly that this determinate thing exists in the world, can never be realized a priori and claimed by reason without experience. So usually, like, if you want to know whether your concept is realized, you go look in experience and you can see. And then you can see whether your concept exists or not. However, as we'll see, the concept of being or being something, it won't be so easy ultimately to discover the principle of the existence of that concept. And we'll have to talk about what is especially difficult about this. But let's look at some of these quotes to transition to the positive. He says, I have led you to the point where philosophy, as far as it now seeks its final and highest object, yet brings itself only so far as the logically mediated concept in thought, is incapable of demonstrating it in its own existence. Okay. In its culmination, the negative philosophy itself contains the demand, this is important, the demand of for the positive, and the philosophy that is aware of itself and understands itself completely certainly has the need to posit the positive outside itself. So the positive doesn't come from the negative, existence doesn't come from the concept. Now, this is one of the important sources of Schelling's disagreement with Hegel. And since we're talking about capacity and power, I think this is an important point to linger on for just a moment. Schelling critiques Hegel on this point. This distinction between the Was and the Das, between Wesen and Existenz, is very important for Schelling, and it's a ground of Schelling's critique of Hegel. And the ground of the critique is simply that, according to Schelling, Hegel actually thinks that concepts are sufficient principles for their own existence. That concepts realize themselves, that they're self-particularizing powers, and that the concept in Hegel doesn't need a separate principle of existence. So Schelling reads Hegel as a monist regarding conceptual truth, and I think Schelling is right. I think Schelling reads Hegel correctly. I think Schelling understood Hegel. I would say not every interpreter of Hegel actually reads Hegel this way. A lot of people don't read Hegel like this. They read Hegel as in a different way. Sometimes people read him in a more Kantian fashion, but certainly Schelling did not read him like that. So I want to look at this quote where Schelling critiques Hegel here. Its fundamental error consists precisely, speaking of Hegel's philosophy, in that it wants to be positive. The difference between Hegel and myself is no smaller in regards to the negative than to the positive philosophy. The philosophy that Hegel presented is the negative driven beyond its limits. It does not exclude the positive, but thinks it has subdued it within itself. The great slogan repeatedly used by his pupils was, the full and real knowledge of divine existence that Kant had denied human reason is upheld by Hegel's philosophy. So I actually think that's what Hegel thinks. We can argue about that if you want, but my Hegel is a big bad monist. But anyway, put that to the side for now. So Schelling, I think, read Hegel well. He understood him. Their dispute is authentic. It's not based on a misunderstanding. There's a real dispute here. And I would even say that there's a real dispute shared in mutual understanding of one another. Right? Okay, so let's go on to the positive philosophy. What is the positive philosophy? This is a source of a lot of disagreement in the literature. This is very difficult reading. I'll make my best effort to simplify some of the arguments here. So the first thing that I want to point out, however, is that for Schelling, and especially here in 1842, concepts don't just exist in the mind, but rather concepts, I think, for Schelling can only be true if the beings to which they correspond are already themselves conceptually mediated. In other words, you can't correspond a concept with an object unless the object shares something in common with the concept. Only on the condition that, in fact, the being itself is conceptually mediated can there be a unity of concept and being. Now, I think for this reason, for Schelling, existence cannot be a predicate, or at least in one important sense. Because if a concept, insofar as it exists, has a new predicate and a distinct predicate from the concept only insofar as it is thought, then we won't be able to correspond or unify the concept in our thought with the concept as it is actualized or realized. So I think for Schelling, actually, the possibility of truth depends in part on existence not being a predicate. And this is something he thinks Hegel rejects. He thinks Hegel actually thinks of existence as a predicate, and it's because Hegel is concerned with thinking the existence of the infinite and the absolute. And according to Schelling, Hegel violates this distinction between negative and positive when he does that. Now, so this is this first quote under positive philosophy. The fact that it exists is something purely contingent. The circumstance of whether it exists or not does not change my concept of the content in the least. So this is a very Kantian reflection here. Nothing new so much. However, what do we begin with in positive philosophy? How can we answer this question? Can we? Why is there anything at all? What is, and then to rephrase it in terms of the Schelling's language coming out of the negative philosophy, what is the principle of existence in virtue of which being exists, or in virtue of which being something exists? Now, I think there's two important points. First, whatever it is in virtue of which the concept of being exists must be non-conceptual. This is the first point. It must be non-conceptual, pre-conceptual, trans-conceptual. There's different ways of saying it. And this is because the concept of being is the most all-encompassing concept. And the principle of existence of concepts must come from outside the concept. And so the only principle of existence for the most all-encompassing concept is that which is beyond every concept. So that's the first point. Why is there something? What the prius, another word that he'll use for this principle of existence, which this is my phrase, principle of existence, okay, is this prius is non-conceptual. But it's not just non-conceptual, it's also not a determinate being, at least not at first. And why is that? It seems as though, because for Schelling, every determinate being is conceptually mediated. If I want to find the principle of existence in virtue of which determinate being or being is, and that requires going beyond the concept. If I have to go beyond the concept of determinate being, and determinate being is realized in every determinate being, To go beyond the concept of determinate being means to go beyond every determinate being. That the principle of existence cannot itself be a determinate being, but must be beyond every determinate being. It must have no determinate being at all. So this, to put it in the simplest language, why is there something? It's not going to be something. At least it seems it's not going to be something, not at first. So why is there something? It seems that we have to begin with that which is, but is devoid of all whatness. That's how Schelling puts it. Or he'll say, das bloße Existierende, or here, den bloßen Existierende, the mere existing itself. That which is, but is devoid of all whatness. Another way of saying it is purely indeterminate being. So Schelling doesn't opt for the kind of Kyoto school option. Another option is to say it's nothing. Is to say that everything comes from nothing. Although that's not what, that's not the, the Western disposition, but that's what the Kyoto school says. They say nothing. But Schelling says it must be, but it cannot be something. It must be, but it must be devoid of whatness. That's the beginning. So we know it's non-conceptual or unprethinkable, unvordenkliche. Again, not a very helpful term. It probably confuses more than it helps. But that's you'll find this term not only in the text but in the literature too. Unvordenkliche, unprethinkable. It's transconceptual and devoid of all whatness. Okay, so let's look at some of these quotes, and then we'll make the next step. If it does not start out from something that occurs in thought, and thus in no way from pure thought, it will start out from that which is before and external to all thought. So that's what we just said. If positive philosophy starts out from that which is external to all thought, it cannot begin with a being that is external to thought in a relative sense, but only with a being that is absolutely external to thought. The being that is external to all thought, however, is just as much beyond all experience as it is before all thought. Positive philosophy begins with a completely transcendent being, and it can no longer be a merely relative prius. So you'll note the negative philosophy thought it had the unconditioned because it had a concept of being, which was what it thought an unconditioned universal, but that turned out to be a conditioned concept. So it was a relative prius. But what we're beginning with in positive philosophy is the absolute, that which is absolutely external to all thought. It transcends everything. He says, rather, I must do away with precisely this concept, the concept of God. So again, we're beginning with what is indeterminate. So we're not even beginning with God. So we shouldn't think that we're beginning with the concept of God because we're not beginning with any concepts at all. In order to proceed from that which just exists, in which nothing at all is thought other than just that which exists, to see whether the divine can be reached from it. So this last clause I will speak to in just a moment. But before we talk about this, we'll kind of, just to bring this point home one more time. As I said, that's the positive philosophy, lets go of the concept and retains only that which purely is, devoid of all whatness. Again, what we just said. That which only exists is precisely that which crushes, very violent language here, crushes everything that may derive from thought, before which thought becomes silent, and before which reason itself bows down. All right, so what are we going to do once we've arrived here? Can we do anything? We're dealing with what is preconceptual. So what can philosophy do? You might think it'll do nothing, but actually Schelling has quite a bit to say from this point. Okay, so the next step in Schelling's reflection is to ask the following question. I think this is a very important step because right now what we've said is, just to remind us, that we have this concept of determinate being, and it can only, I should say, exist in virtue of that which transcends all beings and transcends all concepts, right? So that which is, without further qualification. Hegel also has this idea, right? That determinate being comes from indeterminate being. But the way in which Schelling and Hegel conceive of this relationship is fundamentally different. And so it's something that we'll have to speak about. Schelling's positive philosophy doesn't end here. It actually begins here. It begins here. So the prius, or the beginning of positive philosophy, is this indeterminate being devoid of all whatness. But this isn't where it ends. This is where it begins. So what argument can Schelling give from this point forward? Well, Schelling asks us to reflect on the following possibility. He asks, or the following question, I should say. What would be the case if this principle of existence, in virtue of which determinate being is, what would be the case if it were not a being? What would be the case if it were merely that which is devoid of all whatness? What would follow if that were the case? And Schelling seems to think that if the principle in virtue of which determinate being exists remained purely indeterminate, then determinate being itself would completely vanish and would not be possible. So the argument is rather simple, but it's an important one. And the idea here seems to be that determinate being, or being, can only be determinate if in fact it stands in a determinate relationship with something other than itself. If it stands in a negative relationship to that which is other than it, if it is not something else. Otherwise, being won't be determinate. So if we think about the indeterminate source of determinate being, or the indeterminate source of being, and we say that it is never a being, that it is devoid of all whatness, and that's the end of the story, then determinate being would actually have no limit. It would not stand in relation to anything, because an indeterminate source is just not a source. It has no determination, not even the determination of having a source. So determinate being would have no limit if indeterminacy, which is its source, were not a being. Now, if determinate being has no limit, according to Schelling, that would mean that determinate being is not determinate. It would not be a being. Being would not be a being if it had no limit. The only way that being can be a determinate being is if it has a limit. The world can only be something if it has a limit, if it comes up against something else. And this means, according to Schelling, the following, that the only way that being can really be a being, or that the world can be its own distinct thing, is if the source or principle of the world itself is something. That is to say, only if the pure existence, or the that it is, the being without further qualification itself, is something, or what Schelling will call God. In other turns of phrase that are more paradoxical, Schelling will say only if pure existence is the being beyond being, the Überseiende, only if pure existence itself is a being, Überseiende, or God, is it possible for the world to be determinate. Now, this so far is just a statement about the condition that makes a determinate world possible. But Schelling thinks that the facts borne out by our experience is that we do not live in a purely indeterminate world. We do not live in a world that is just flux, that is indeterminate. We don't live in the world in which all cows are black, as Hegel would put it. That's not the world we encounter, the world where all cows are black. Rather, we experience a world that is determinate. We encounter determinacy. The world itself is amenable to our concepts. So Schelling thinks this is a fact of experience, that this possibility of a determinate world is present, and we can engage with it. This is also what makes science possible. Now, this means, according to Schelling, that because in fact there is a determinate world that we encounter, again, our experience is not just pure indeterminacy. It follows, according to Schelling, that there must be a God. This means that the indeterminate principle of determinate being must itself be a being, or what he'll say, must itself be God. Again, otherwise, determinate being wouldn't have a limit and wouldn't itself be determinate and would therefore become indeterminate, and the determinacy which we experience, which we find as real, is something which we couldn't account for in principle. And in principle, shouldn't even be possible. So this is what he calls, this is the a posteriori demonstration that the pure existence at the source of determinate being is God. So let me read a couple passages where more or less Schelling says what I just did. That's the basic argument of positive philosophy. The argument of positive philosophy wants to transform the indeterminate, non-conceptual source of determinate existence into God, or as we'll say, the Lord of Being, the Überseiende, the being beyond being. And note these phrases, Überseiende, is, a German translation of this Greek idea that the first principle of all things is not just ousia, but it's hyperousia, as Pseudo-Dionysius would put it, right? It's the ousia beyond ousia, right? So this idea of the Überseiende is not a new idea. It's as old as Pseudo-Dionysius, and of course he gets this idea from Plato, who says the good is beyond being, right? So let's read a few passages. This is the hardest part of the argument. So here we go. If positive philosophy does not start out from experience, nothing prevents it from going toward experience, and thereby proving a posteriori what it has to prove, that its prius is God, that is, that which is above being. There's the Überseiende. So that I make myself completely clear, not the absolute prius itself will be proved, but rather what the consequences are that follow from this. These must be factually proved, and only thereby do we prove the divinity of that prius, that it is God, and that God therefore exists. So the important point here is we do not prove that there is the indeterminate. We prove that the indeterminate is God, according to Schelling. That's what is proved. The indeterminate is the beginning, and the proof is that the indeterminate is God, or the Überseiende. Now, this, according to Schelling, is supposed to establish two things. We'll look at this last quote here. Let us call the positive philosophy that comprehends the actual God, and thus, in general, not simply the possibility, but the actuality of things, the positive philosophy. So the positive philosophy establishes not only the actuality of things, but also God. God and the actuality of things, for Schelling, go together. You don't have a determinate world unless the source of the determinate world is determinate. That's a simple idea. The world itself can only be determinate, can only be conceptualized if the source of the world is also determinate. That is God. So positive philosophy wants to establish that the source of determinate being is God. That's what it wants to do. So if people try to explain what the positive philosophy is to you, and they give you no theological content, and they don't talk about God at all, you should be suspicious. To radically secularize Schelling's late philosophy is a highly questionable endeavor. I'd like to say this, right? That what we have here is a move in the direction of theism. And it's a move in the direction of theism in order to save the scientific character of the world. So it's conservative in a number of ways. It wants to conserve the possibility of science, but it does so in such a way that leads Schelling into something like a more conservative theism than what you'll see in Hegel's thought. So a very important point here, though, that I really want to stress is that Schelling is not somehow dialectically deriving the determinate out of the indeterminate. He's not reading the determinate out of the indeterminate. He thinks you can't do that. And in fact, Schelling thinks that's what Hegel thought he could do. So you look at the Wissenschaft der Logik, right? You begin with Sein, right? Unbestimmtes Sein. And out of that, you get some kind of determinate being, Dasein. And it's this dialectical and immanent conceptual development whereby you start with the indeterminate and come to the determinate. Schelling is not reading determinacy out of indeterminacy. In fact, he points out that we simply find determinacy and we recognize that it would not be possible unless the source of determinacy itself were determinate. That's the way Schelling works. So this means it's always possible that, in fact, it's always possible that the world doesn't exist. It's contingent fact that there is a world and that there is an intelligible world. It's always possible that, in fact, the source of existence didn't create the world. And so this is Schelling's voluntarism, right? The origin of the world is contingent. And as Schelling will describe, and he had been using this language for a long time, go back to the freedom essay a few decades before, where God ultimately wills creation, and God may not have willed creation. It's always a possibility. This is a big difference between Hegel and Schelling. Hegel thinks God must create the world, to put it in theological terms, or that logic itself must give rise to nature in virtue of what it is. It doesn't produce nature through an act of contingent willing. That's not how the transition from logic to nature works in Hegel. So to explain this relationship just a little more, we can read this one quote here. The Prius thus posits only with complete freedom, without being somehow required by its nature to posit a being. He does not directly posit his own being, but instead posits a being that is distinct from his, in which his being is more accurately negated or suspended rather than posited. Hence, his being is only indirectly posited in this being that is distinct from his. So basically, the idea is this: the indeterminate gives us the determinate world, and then in virtue of the fact that the indeterminate world is, the Prius itself has its own distinct being, but only as that which is negated by the world that is posited. And so God doesn't directly give himself determinacy, but gives himself determinacy indirectly through creating something distinct from himself. Okay, so I hope that you'll allow just a little bit of this theological language. It's also Schelling's, but we can try to clean it up as much as we can. But I think that there is this, it does help kind of fill in the picture a little bit. Okay, so before we finish, I just want to mention a couple things. First, as you probably have already noted, this is highly paradoxical, it seems. Okay. So let's not ignore the paradox or pretend it isn't there. Rather, it's central to the whole discourse. I want to be careful, though, because there's one sense in which the beginning of positive philosophy is not paradoxical at all. So the one sense in which it's not paradoxical is that which is transconceptual or not conceptual, it can't really stand in a contradictory relation to anything because there's no concept there. What, as it were, is completely non-conceptual isn't going to stand in a contradictory relation. If I say all S is P and some S is not P, I have the concept P that is predicated of S and is not predicated of S. But when I'm in a space that's completely devoid of all concepts, I'm not going to have a contradiction, nor will a contradiction even be possible. So it's not exactly accurate to say that the principle of all existence as purely transconceptual is contradictory. That is not exactly correct, and Schelling will point that out. But on the other hand, it's inherently paradoxical that philosophy would try to determine conceptually what transcends every concept, and would say about what is not conceptual that it is not conceptual. That is a paradox, because then you're saying the non-conceptual is, its concept is not being conceptual. And so inevitably, just like we would expect, the question, why is there anything, of course leads to paradox, because whatever is said will be something. And so you'll end up in an infinite regress. You'll end up in a paradox. So what positive philosophy does is it tries to take the incomprehensible and make it comprehensible. It takes what is not conceptual and tries to transform it into something conceptual. And this is what Schelling says over and over again. However, it does seem that as a result, what will always happen is you'll end up with something like, as he says, the inverted idea, reason set outside of itself. So we'll look at some of these passages here and then say something about how Schelling can respond to this paradox. He says, positive philosophy concerns itself with this only in order, this being the indeterminate, the pure existence at the ground of everything, only in order to transform precisely that which is incomprehensible a priori into what is a posteriori comprehensible. What is incomprehensible a priori becomes comprehensible in God. This would be the proper business of a positive philosophy that seeks to get from that which necessarily exists as a non-conceptual prius to the concept, to the essence, or God, as posterius. It posits, this is the positive philosophy, non-conceptual being in order to reach from it to the concept. Again, so we want to go from the non-conceptual to the concept. Schelling is not saying let's all disappear into the transconceptual and just stay there. The point is to recognize it at the origin and then to try to conceptualize it. That's the idea, to move towards science rather than away from it. We must then start from being devoid of the concept, which is precisely what we want to do in the positive philosophy. But of course, it does seem as though we end up in paradox. Now, this paradox itself is built into Schelling's system because Schelling will say that positive philosophy is a philosophia. It's a love of wisdom, and it's fundamentally incomplete. So he says, the proof is therefore also never finished. That is, the proof that the indeterminate principle of existence is God. And for this reason, this science is only a philosophy, only a philosophy, but it's, of course, philosophy. Right? So it's an incomplete science. He says that again, in this context, even the present is no limit, but is here a view that still opens into a future that will also be nothing other than a progressive proof of the existence of that power that rules over being. So a progressive proof of the existence of the power that rules over being, of that which is no longer just the being with which negative philosophy busies itself, not just a concept, but is rather that which is above being. So it is that which is above being, the being above being. So what is this progressive proof of the existence of God? And I'm almost done here, and we'll have a little time for questions. It's incomplete because every time you actually think, every time that you think that which is beyond being, you transform it into a being. Every time you think the indeterminate, it becomes determinate. Every time you think the transconceptual, it becomes conceptual. And so once you have God determinately relating to the world, then you have a greater sphere of determinacy. Rather than just world that's determinate by itself, which is impossible for Schelling, you have a God that's the Lord of being. But then you have a richer and greater determinacy, and you need to give an account of that determinacy. And that will have to come from the unprethinkable or pure thatness or being without whatness. But insofar as you determine that to be God, right, a God beyond God, then you'll have the same problem all over again. And you'll have to posit the indeterminate beyond the determinate once more. So what do we see? We see an infinite regress that follows. But Schelling calls this infinite regress in a positive way. It's the progressive proof that the prius is God without end, a proof that never ends. So human experience, the experience of positive philosophy, is the perpetual proving, the perpetual conceptualizing of what is not conceptual. It's the perpetual proof of God's existence. And he thinks the whole of human experience is involved in this progress. We have, so he's concerned with mythology in his late philosophy. He's concerned with revelation. And these philosophies of mythology and philosophies of revelation are stages, even if they're not yet philosophical. They become philosophical maybe, or this progress may become philosophical. They're stages in the revelation of God, stages in the revelation of the principle of existence as divine. And so he looks back throughout, one could say, the history of human consciousness and human thought as, and then orders it and organizes it as a progressive realization of the first principle as divine. But it never ends. It's incomplete. And so can the system of German idealism be completed? No. That's what Schelling says at the end. Trump can't complete the system. Neither can Schelling. Nobody can. That guy on the street in New York was confused, right? Trump's never going to complete it. He didn't complete it, and it's not going to get completed. You'll excuse my little joke there. If you haven't seen this clip, you must. Out of all the terrible things that happened because of Trump, one of the only good things was this grad student on the streets of New York who said Trump would complete the system of German idealism, which he didn't. And some people maybe were very disappointed to see that it wasn't completed. So Schelling says, look, all jokes aside, Schelling says, look, Hegel thought he could complete the system because he thought that concepts could be sufficient principles of their own existence. He thought that somehow the concept could be really unconditioned, but rather it isn't. And the fact that the concept isn't unconditioned is ultimately what leads to this fundamental incompleteness. So how we understand the limit of the power of a concept is really important for one of these fundamental questions in classical German philosophy. Why is there something and not nothing? And how you think about the limits of conceptual capacity, I think really has a strong impact on how you approach this kind of question. Finally, someone may object. One could kind of think of kind of an atheist objection here and say, well, the fact of the infinite regress just indicates that there is no God to be proved, that you're infinitely progressing towards nothing. And maybe it's better to think with the Kyoto school and say, it's really nothing that's at the source, not something, and not just being, but just nothing. However, Schelling wants to say that if you go there, you need to accept the consequence that you can't account for your experience of determinacy. And I think he also thinks that if you take this route, then science itself will be impossible. I think that really is Schelling's view, that the possibility of a determinate world requires a source that is itself determinate. And that is what he calls God, the determinate source of all things, the being beyond all being, the Übersein. So Schelling thinks that actually theism, the kind of theism that we're progressing towards, if we think of it as a kind of theism, however we want to categorize this, it is actually an attempt to preserve science and to preserve the possibility of a determinate world. And so the challenge then for the atheist would be, I think from Schelling's side, is to show how science is possible without God. And I think that's actually a very, for Schelling, that isn't a live or plausible possibility. And I actually don't think it was one for Hegel either. For Schelling and Hegel both, it's the Reich Gottes that really preserves the possibility of knowing and science. Certainly not atheism, right? That's in some way the wrong position to take. Anyway, that went a little longer, but I think it's still within the time. So thank you very much for the opportunity, Plato, and I look forward to whatever time we have for questions.
Thank you so much, Greg, for this exciting and very clear talk. So let's open to the Q&A sessions. Is there any questions from the audience? Heikki, you may go first.
Maybe I'll just start with a completely amateurish, I guess Hegel-inspired question. Kind of, what do you make of all of this talk about existence of concepts? I mean, Hegel would say, well, I mean, Schelling is just kind of peddling with the Vorstellung there. I mean, what is this talk about existence? You haven't yet got there. Just follow now the damn logic and get to the concept of existence rather than kind of right away starting peddling with the Vorstellung. So, I mean, what's your view here? I mean, obviously, you've written a big book on Hegel, which I haven't yet read. I'm looking forward to reading the foundation stuff, which I do know.
That's a great question. Yeah, that's a great question. And I didn't say a word about Hegel because, like you said, I've already said too much, so I thought I should try to talk about someone else. And I find Schelling so fascinating exactly for this reason that you asked, Vorstellung. Hegel, I think it's early on in one of the remarks on being, nothing, becoming. Hegel defends the ontological argument against Kant. He does it explicitly. He says, is $100 really a concept, or is it right to say of the representation of Vorstellung of $100 that it's a concept? And Hegel says that's not really a concept. It's not really a concept because it doesn't have the self-reference. It's not self-particularizing. So if I have the concept of $100, doesn't mean that I have $100. The concept of $100 isn't itself $100. But take, for example, the concept of a unity, or the concept of oneness. Oneness itself is one. And the concept of oneness itself is one. It's one thing among other things. And so oneness is a concept because it has this self-predicative feature whereby oneness is both a universal and it's a particular. Oneness is itself one thing, whereas $100, or the representation of $100, is not itself $100. So I think Hegel's objection is exactly what you would say, which is, namely, sorry, something just fell on my roof there, is that Schelling has confused the concept with the Vorstellung, and that actually he has misunderstood the structure of absolute concepts. Absolute concepts are self-particularizing. Oneness itself is one, being itself is a being, et cetera, et cetera. They're self-realizing. And by introducing this absolute difference between concept and existence, he has actually taken something like the $100 and absolutized it, right? And so that's the mistake, I think, from Hegel's perspective. The retort from Schelling's side, I can imagine, and this is where things get really difficult, is that Hegel is really good, really clear, as long as you stay within the science of logic itself. And in fact, it's actually my favorite text because it's, by my lights, like the easiest way to see how a concept can particularize itself and to do it successfully in a purely logical way. But then there's this very tricky transition, right, from concept to nature. And I think Schelling reads Hegel as saying the concept of logic particularizes itself as nature, makes itself natural, externalizes itself or something into nature. And Schelling seems to think that this is not a legitimate move, or that somehow when it comes to that transition, we have an existence that doesn't follow from logic. But I think, as Schelling would put it, all you get from logic is logic of nature, or then logic of spirit, but you don't get nature or spirit as such. But nature and spirit as such will have to come from the outside. So I think that's maybe where Schelling's critique, where he would have to find some response. Because Schelling does actually acknowledge that unconditioned concepts have this self-particularizing feature. Like he says, being is a being, like I said. It's just that being is a being, maybe it can realize itself logically, but beyond that, it's not going to be able to somehow. But I think you're right. There is something indefinite about this concept of existence that isn't really fully clarified. And Schelling would say that's because it transcends concepts. So he actually wouldn't think that to be an objection. Of course, from the Hegelian side, it is an objectionable point. So thanks for the question. It's exactly where the fault line is, I think. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Either too clear or not clear enough.
Daniel.
Hi, thank you so much for a really wonderful talk. I thought it was really brilliant, and I haven't spent much time with the later Schelling, but it was very clear, so that should dispel any. It's not a matter of lack of clarity,
Okay,
but I was wondering if you could say any more, just because I'm totally ignorant about the role that Jacobi has to play in this whole debate, right? Because it seems that the whole this whole problem, this realism debate, and whether or not we should begin with existence, the fact that things are, or whether or not we should begin from concepts, etc.
Yeah.
This all seems to, emerge in this scene in the late 18th century, thanks to Jacobi. And so I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about the role that he plays in the development of Schelling's thinking.
Yeah, that's a great question, and thank you for asking it, because Jacobi is one of the thinkers that Schelling considers. So this is 1842, right? So it's already quite a few decades from when Jacobi was active, and then it's also the Schelling-Jacobi dispute had already occurred a few decades earlier. But I think it was important for Schelling, and it was so important that Jacobi is one of the philosophers that he needs to argue against in this text. So he argues against, so the context of the argument in 1842 is that Schelling wants to say that the existence of God is determined a posteriori. So this is a very kind of Jacobian point, right? We can't just read off existence from the concept. One of Jacobi's complaints was, once you've withdrawn into the concept, reality disappears, and then you have nothing left. And actually, Schelling, in the end, agrees with that. That's exactly what happens. And actually, what Schelling has to, and of course, what Schelling has to do is, the goal of philosophy is to get existence back again after you've lost it. All right. So in that way, it's deeply inspired by the Jacobi. But this a posteriori proof of God's existence that you see in 1842 Schelling, he wants to distinguish the different ways of thinking about God in an a posteriori way. So one way is to just be an ordinary, say, early modern empiricist. They're clearly wrong. All the idealists know they're wrong, so let's not, it's actually like very quick, like it's like a paragraph or something. And Jacobi is better than them. He gets more time than them, but he's also wrong, as are any kind of like romantic empiricism. And then he also critiques Jakob Böhme. So he calls theosophical mysticism is another kind of empiricism where you directly experience God. You begin from it, and he says the problem with all of these is they begin from experience. They begin from experience. But positive philosophy begins from indeterminate existence as such. So the big difference, according to between Jacobi, early modern empiricists, and Jakob Böhme, and why he disagrees with all of them, is that they all begin with experience. But the positive philosophy begins from that which transcends all determinacy, and therefore it begins with what transcends all experience. And then what it does is it does employ our experience of determinate being to make an argument about God, but it ultimately begins with this indeterminate. And that's not how this indeterminate beyond all experience, which is not how Jacobi, the early modern empiricists, or Jakob Böhme begin. So that's actually really interesting. So he calls it, I think, metaphysical empiricism. So his empiricism is a metaphysical empiricism. And he wants to distinguish it from these other kinds. But that's hugely important. Jacobi was right, apparently, that you can't get reality out of the concept. And if you withdraw into the concept, you'll lose all of existence. And so then the big question is, how do we get it back again? Even though Jacobi refuted himself and his view was self-contradictory, there was something to it, right? I mean, I think Hegel also liked Jacobi's critique. But of course, he responded to it differently. So that's not a complete answer, but it's the beginning, right? So what I would point you to, and I'll stop talking, is the chapter in Grounding a Positive Philosophy called Metaphysical Empiricism. There it is. It's this book here. Where he discusses Jacobi. And yeah, that's something that you can go back through to see what in particular is problematic. But again, he shares the same defect as all other forms of empiricism. So yeah, so I think that's also very interesting. Actually, Schelling says that Jakob Böhme is closer to Hegel in a way than to Schelling. People always connect Schelling to Burma because Schelling takes this idea of the ungrund, or the non-ground, as from the Freedom Essay. But Burma actually thinks that, in a way, God empties himself into the world. That's according to Schelling, Hegel's view. Hegel makes Burma conceptual. And Schelling rejects this whole emanation business, that God is somehow emptying himself into the world. Schelling ends up having a more conservative, theistic view that God wills a world that he didn't have to. And in fact, according to Schelling, that's the only way that you can make sense of the possibility of science. So it's actually kind of funny that, a lot of people think the late Schelling is really radical because the system is incomplete and it's not, it's not finished yet. But the only way it's incomplete is because he becomes some kind of theist. He actually becomes more orthodox and more conservative. And a lot of people, I think, who are listening to Schelling's lectures are very disappointed that they're encountering an old guy who's become quite conservative. And he's quite conservative, Those days of the rambunctious, youthful Schelling, who's, this of the identity philosophy is long gone.